I want to show you my favorite watercolor palette and review it for you, but I also really need to practice, and so you can join me in painting watercolor eye studies. I am going to do a lot of swatching in this video just to prepare you for it, and that's so that you can see the new paints in action, but I also want to show you some other art supplies, just a glimpse that arrived with the latest package, then share some of my painting process and a glimpse of the studio, and so I guess I would call it a studio vlog. And here's the package. It's been expected for about a week, and it's from that Czech shop that I like to order art supplies from if I can't find them locally here in Slovakia. I ordered these cheaper brushes because they looked cool, and then this Ganzai Tambi portable set to try alongside my large Kurteke palette. And a Kanzen Montoile 300 GS sandpaper to test out and include in my upcoming watercolor papers video. But most importantly, they recently added these ShinHan PWC premium watercolor tubes, individual tubes, to their assortment, and that reminded me that I ran out of about 4 tubes in my set. The set that I would like to talk about today. And while I was on it, I ordered a few more shades to add to my collection as well. About the set, I bought it 2 years ago and it cost me about 90 euros, which is a lot but not too much for 33 pieces of 15 milliliter tubes of artist grade paint, it isn't? Plus, this particular packaging was limited edition, and if someone is a watercolor nerd like I am, and the set says limited edition, that made it even more attractive. Now that I added 12 new shades, I own a total of 45 colors from this Korean brand. I made swatches of the original 33 colors from the set when it first arrived, but I want to make a new chart, so let's get to it. I still can't believe I spent half my Sunday doing this. Making charts is time consuming, and it is questionable how important it is when you have limited time to even progress in your painting skills. But I really wanted to make this video for you since there is always a lot of questions about materials, and it's helpful to have a dedicated video to reference that. And I paint a lot with these now. I want to include a black stripe to see the opacity of the paints instead of just relying on what the label says, and I had to test out my inks to see which one is waterproof. Luckily I did, because only one was. I always forget which one, I don't use inks too often, and then I forget to label the waterproof one. So now a few info about the line of paints. They are called PWC Premium Watercolors. Sometimes they are labeled SWC, and it's essentially the same. Important is the word premium, which distinguishes them from other lines of watercolors that ShinHan produces. It is very confusing, but they have a lesser grade of watercolor paints called professional. I've tried those in the past too, but just a couple of shades. Most of them were intense in color but also stained the paper a lot and were much more opaque than what I consider good watercolors for learning the technique. I was not a big fan. I'm just mentioning it so that you don't confuse the two. Let's mention some of the really attractive aspects of these watercolors. In this line of watercolors, ShinHan uses single pigments in most of the colors, which means improved consistency of the paint and makes them mix together well. Colors are vibrant and most of them are transparent, which is something that I'm definitely looking for in watercolor paints. And on top of this, their price is remarkably low for the quality they represent. But I will talk about prices later on because there are always gaps depending on where you buy your paints. So this is the basic info that's available on their website too, but here is my experience. I just love the colors and the paint is creamy and a real treat to work with. It flows beautifully on all papers that I've tried and doesn't get chalky when it dries. There was something else written on ShinHan website that really caught my eye, and that was something like the uniform spread of the watercolors leaves no hard lines at the edges of washes. And this made me wonder, this made me jump. Will there be no hard edges typical for watercolor when I use the wet on dry technique? Because I do utilize that a lot in my paintings. But I tested that against my Schminky Horadam paints and honestly I didn't see the difference. There were edges just where they belong, so I'm calm now. And I don't really know what they meant by that sentence. I've been working with them for over 2 years now, and I can safely say that they do a great job overall, and you won't regret if you decide to reach for this, but there is a catch to all that sounds too good to be true, And with ShinHan PWCs, it appears to be the light fastness. I'm not Rembrandt and never will be, and I don't think I need my paintings to live and keep their colors for hundreds of years, but at the same time, the original art that goes well and someone really wishes to buy and display needs to be able to keep the colors for longer than few years. With that being said, I'm looking for a reasonable light fastness for artworks made for exhibitions and commissions, but also I practice a lot, and those exercises, studies and sketchbook explorations don't need to be made with paints that are like quote-unquote made of gold, where I pay like 15 to 20 euros for a tube. And yeah, Daniel Smith paints cost that much, at least here in Europe they do. Out of all 45 colors that I currently own, only 24 are labeled very light fast. ShinHan uses a 3-star rating for light fastness, so these have 3 stars. 2 colors from the set are very fugitive, that's Vermilion, Hue and Opera, but the rest is somewhere in the middle. I have yet to do my own light fastness test, and I will let you know how that went, but there are already swatches of these paints tested against the light on Kimberly Crick Art's website, and I'll leave the link to that helpful article in the description. She also has a very helpful YouTube channel about watercolor, so a shout out to her and all the links down below. To sum this up, some of these colors can fade over time, some fade significantly fast, and to avoid that I don't use my PWCs for the important works. But honestly, this year I only focus on studying and practice, and I spent a lot of paint for that. These work beautifully right now and I'm loving the price. And just to clarify further, because some of you pigment lovers really study up on all the pigment properties and can tell from the top of your head insane and admirable amount of knowledge, I do not think none of these are safe for your exhibition artworks. The general rule of thumb would be to get the ones that are rated with 3 stars, and I bet these wouldn't fail you. I do not have enough time right now to compare the exact pigments they are using for every watercolor with those that other brands use, but there is a channel that specializes in that aspect of watercolor. Denise knows so much about pigments that you should definitely check out her videos, even though I did not find dedicated video about ShinHans yet, but maybe if you ask her, she will make one. One last thing I want to talk about is the price and accessibility. These might be harder to get. I am able to get these from nearby Czech Republic. They have art supply e-shop that has individual tubes now, and I don't think they are available in Slovakia at all. I hardly found these on Amazon, and I really don't know how easy these are to get in US stores, but they do have them at Jackson's Art Supplies. However, I was comparing the prices and was shocked by the difference. I buy this for a very reasonable price. Tubes range between 260 to 6 euros per tube in Czech shop, and Jackson's prices range between 8.4 euros to 15.36 euros for the same product, and I wouldn't get this for such high price. Because that's the price that I can get even better watercolors for, and this is an important part of every review, to compare quality and price, because if you have 13 euros to spend on one tube of watercolor, then I would say get Horadams. I don't know if this will help at least some of you, but the shop that I order my PWCs from ships to about 26 countries. I will leave the link in the description in case that you are running around trying to find these somewhere for a reasonable price, and maybe they will be able to help you. So here is my collection of 33 colors extended by some greens and granulating violets. More on specific color palettes will be said in separate videos as I create paintings with them. Let's go paint, because that's what art materials are for, and you should never forget that, says the one who's able to spend 2 days just swatching the palette. I'm painting eye studies, and my first limited palette is Quinacridone Red, Permanent Yellow Light and Cobalt Blue. I added sepia, but just for convenience, so that I'm slightly quicker with getting darker colors. I'm using one medium-sized round brush, then cheap synthetic liner brush and a fluffy flat brush for softening some edges. I want to mix the paints as much as possible and practice adjusting the skin tone according to my needs. It's also important to choose the kind of primaries that work well for you and produce the results that you are looking for, because 3 colors still limit to some extent, but I will get into that in some other dedicated color mixing video. Here's Pinterest for some reference photo and let's start with a quick sketch. I don't use pencil to sketch right now, only the liner brush and very transparent paint to place the first lines. This forces me to really focus hard on proportions and measure twice before I make a mark. And it's really hard for me because I'm so impatient and want quick results very often. I have to train and motivate myself like a child to focus and discipline. After the eye is sketched, I start adding very light and transparent washes of paint. First usually the general skin tone and later add shading. I usually use very different technique for finished painting than for studies like this. I made a video about how I created a very detailed eye study piece and I will link it for you down below. That method relies a lot on observing every inch of your reference and basically copying it. This time my goal is to loosen up, use wider, less controlled brush strokes and stop working within the lines of my sketch, rather focus on adding masses of color where I see them and where I would expect them to be based on the anatomy of the eye. This is a hard effort. I think it's much easier to learn how to realistically copy your reference than to interpret something you see and feel in a loose and suggestive way. I can see that on myself and how my brain needs intense focus to be able to work loosely, and every time that I lose focus, I find myself coloring my line work. Hardest part of the process is to trust your decisions. Once you know where the shadow area is and you make that brush stroke, let it be. Don't second guess yourself. Let it dry. Do not try to rethink it, correct it, smudge it, or add more pigment to cover it. Those actions usually lead to patchy results and almost always look worse than the original brushstroke does. You can smoothen some of those edges though, using your fluffy flat brush. But some edges look really nice if they're left this sharp. I want to create more studies today, explore different angles and make a good use of my time in the studio. If you practice a lot and you feel like your sketches get worse and worse, which is what happens to me often, take a break and try tomorrow. Maybe you're just tired. I use a lot of my mental capacity for painting. It looks like relax, and while it often is because focus is ultimately only on one thing, it requires a lot of energy, and once that runs out, recharge is in order, so don't be too hard on yourself. One more try and I have to run home. I'm on a very tight schedule to paint, having a 7-month-old at home, and I've never been this productive. It's a paradox, but having a small window of time forces me to plan ahead, cut all the necessities and just get the stuff done. I take a quick picture of my studies before I leave the studio so that I can think about them the next day at home or during a walk with the baby and try to figure out if I achieved what I was aiming for. It's okay to take a step back and analyze the results for a moment, maybe ask for feedback or advice, but also don't spend too much time trying to find the best way to paint something. Just move on to the next painting and try to solve those problems there. The next day I wanted to try out different primaries, and so I picked Prussian blue, permanent red and yellow ochre. I also wanted to test out these new brushes that were sent to me. 3 of them are round synthetic brushes, Princeton Velvet Touch, and one is Princeton Neptune. It's a 3/4 square wash brush. Sizes of the round brushes are 4, 6 and 8, and they have a lovely tip. I have yet to paint more with them to do a full review, but so far it's been great. I came to a conclusion that I didn't like how I mixed the skin tones in the first 3 studies. They were too cold and I really like warmer skin tones. I'm not sure what went wrong, but I assumed that my red and yellow were too cold, and so I switched to warmer versions. In the end, I like the colors a little better this time. I have to say, I really like working with these watercolors, and I forgot to mention that even when I leave them on a plate until the next painting session, they don't mind it and re-wet quite easily when it's time to work again. One last study and then I take a break and paint something else. Eyes are a window to the soul and really a center of almost every portrait, very important part that people relate to. And it is crucial to get them right in a portrait painting. But right doesn't necessarily mean to include all the details, and I really need to work on that. Thank you so much for watching. If this video helped you in any way, let me know by giving it a thumbs up, and I will see you very soon. Have a great evening.